Alrighty. Hopefully we are live here. What's up, everybody? We'll give this a moment to just kind of catch up. In the meantime, if you're watching the stream after the fact, after it's recorded, hey, thank you for checking this out. I hope your week is going well. My week here is going well. It's sunny here in Seattle, which is rare this time of year, so nothing to complain about there. One thing here as we get started, I'm still trying to figure out the software I have here. So I am, just for fun, going to try out playing a little intro here, and hopefully it works. And if it works and you like it, let me know down below what you think of the vibe to it. So let's go ahead and try this out. Okay, so hopefully that couple seconds, hopefully that worked. Hopefully the audio came through okay. Trying to play around with this, have some more fun, and kind of be consistent with that kind of 8-bit comic book vibe that I've been working with on the videos. So like I said, if you like that, let me know down below. I've had a few comments that they like that kind of 8-bit audio to it. So we'll see what other people think. But if you are just kind of checking out the live stream for the first time, thank you for tuning in. The general outline of how I like to be doing this here on the YouTube live streams is basically really focused on just kind of question and answer. Want to have a chance to basically answer questions that I get from the different developer communities that I'm a part of. We'll talk a little bit then about some kind of new, exciting things that I've been paying attention to in the world of software development or remote working. And then we'll do any live Q&A that we have from anyone that happens to be tuning in. And then if we have questions at the end, we'll talk through those, and then we'll do kind of a question of the week just to wrap it up and kind of give us all something to chat about. So if you have a question, if you're watching live, you could leave it in the live chat. We'll answer it at the end. If you're watching after the fact, go ahead and leave a question in the comments. I'll get back to it, maybe even include it in next week's video or a future video, I guess, if it's further than a week out from now. So with that said, we're going to be talking a lot about sort of view binding and data binding right now. I had multiple questions about that this week, and it ties in with talking about Android Studio 3.6, which we're all going to talk about. So let's go ahead and kind of jump in to all of that. So if we go over here to question number 1 for the week, which was when to use data binding. And I think that is a very relevant question right now, mostly because of view binding just dropping with Android Studio 3.6, which finally is released to the stable channel this week. So as you kind of compare view binding and data binding, a lot of those questions have been coming up. And so there's kind of a few points that I want to chat through here, and we can kind of use these to just discuss data binding a little bit and talk about it and how it might compare to view binding, and how it also might compare to other things like the Kotlin synthetic accessors, or even just using find view by ID. So one question that I think is worth exploring when considering when to use data binding is if you are architecting your UI layer of your Android application using something like MVVM or MVVI. And the reason I think that these lend themselves really well to data binding is because they really are set up to expose a data object of some time that then needs to be bound into the UI. It's not actively setting the UI itself. It's exposing that data to the UI presentation layer, and it's leaving that up to kind of the implementation to go ahead and actually put into the UI. So if you're not using MVVM or MVI, something like that, and maybe you're using like MVP or MVC, then data binding probably doesn't fit your use case very well, and it likely is not going to be that helpful because it's probably going to have to be shoehorned into what you're trying to do. So that'd be the first thing I think would consider is, are you doing something like MVVM, MVVI, where you're really exposing that data? The next question is, are you working with live data? Now, the reason I bring up live data is because data binding specifically has some nice functionality built into it to support data binding in a pretty seamless way. You can expose a live data property from your view model in, say, an MVVM pattern. And if you then define that as a data object within your binding class within the XML, then that data will automatically kind of be unwrapped from the live data, and you can use it within binding expressions within your XML. And so this is really powerful. This avoids having to create any type of binding adapter, which is nice because that's less overhead. And it means that you can take whatever data is in that live data and start putting it into your different text boxes and labels and all that stuff without having to, again, unwrap it. You can just use it as is. And so if you're using live data and you're doing something like MVVM, then data binding could work pretty seamlessly for you. Now, the other question to ask is, do you really want to avoid manual binding of data to UI? So if you have a lot of different fields, you have a lot of data you want to get into your UI layer, that might start to become a lot of manual boilerplate code to look up all those views and start updating them one by one. So that might be a reason why you want to avoid using something like find view by ID or even Kotlin synthetics, and simply use data binding and the binding class that gets generated for you. However, if you have a really simple UI, you have a very simple screen, maybe one or two pieces of data that need to be updated, it might not be a big deal to just use find view by ID. And in fact, in that situation, I would suggest not using data binding most likely, because I think it's overhead in that case, especially if that data is not changing. And so that brings me to the last point here for when to use data binding. Is your binding logic really simple? So if you have a screen that basically loads a title and a description, and then that's it, it's not changing, it's not updating dynamically, and you're really just going to set it directly into, let's say, a couple of text views, then there's probably not a lot of benefit, again, to using data binding here. You're probably better off to keep it really simple, use find view by ID or some other method, and just set that data directly. Data binding starts to add some complexity to your project, and if you're not getting benefit of it from the binding logic that it can provide, then it's probably not worth it. So what types of binding logic might be beneficial here? Well, a few examples of things that I have done with data binding that have been pretty helpful over the years. Simple animations. Let's say you want to be updating the title on your screen as new data is coming in, for example. Data binding can be really nice here, because as you update that title property on your live data or on your Kotlin flow or observable property, whatever that is, as you change that value, you can automatically update that UI element on your screen through a binding expression, and that's what data binding provides to you. Additionally, data binding lets you use things like binding adapters, which are sort of this intermediate layer. You have kind of your view model, let's say up here, that exposes the data, your XML down here. A binding adapter can kind of sit here in the middle, and it takes that data from whatever observable property, and then it's able to actually put that data into the UI. And so with that, you can do things like animating that data as it goes in, loading images, swapping out fonts and things like that. So you do a lot of powerful things there. But if you don't need to animate, if you don't have some type of complex binding logic, another good example is just if a field is empty or null, hiding that text altogether, or maybe putting a default in there. So this is the type of simple binding logic that you could put in a binding adapter, or you could even sometimes put that into the XML itself. But again, that's starting to be additional logic that gets hidden from the standard code, maybe your fragment or activity. And so again, that's something to consider, is where is the complexity going? You're still having complexity if you're animating, you still have complexity when you're hiding and showing views. So it's about really where are you gonna put that? So that's it for this now. Now, like I said, we're gonna be talking about view binding as well. So we're gonna talk more about data binding and how it compares to view binding a little bit later. But for now, we'll just kind of review these points one more time. You know, if you want to work with data binding, I think it works really well in projects that are using some type of MVVM or MVI architecture, particularly if you're exposing data with live data, because it makes the binding really simple in your binding expressions within the layout XML. Obviously, if you are wanting to use data binding, it's probably because you want to avoid doing a bunch of find view by ID calls. However, you could also do something like Butterknife, Cotterknife, Kotlin synthetic accessors. So there are other options as well. So I would only consider data binding if you have maybe a lot of data you want to put into your UI. It's going to be updating frequently. And you don't have any type of real simple binding logic. You start to have a lot of complex binding logic in terms of transforming the data into the UI. And in those situations, that's where I think data binding can really start to shine. So we'll put data binding on hold for the moment, and we'll kind of jump over into the what's new section. And there is a lot new lately. I kind of tweeted about this recently. It seemed a lot of people kind of agreed, but it feels like in the last couple of weeks, we've gotten a lot of stuff thrown at us in the world of Android development. We've had the first Android 11 developer preview and beta to actually try Android 11 on your development devices. We have a new material motion spec and associated libraries with that to make it even easier. To make it even easier for us to implement on Android apps. And then we have a couple of different versions of Android Studio even being dropped on us for us to test out. So we're just going to take a minute and kind of chat through some of those updates. So we're going to jump over to Chrome here, hopefully. There we go. Okay, yeah. Yep, okay, so we're over here in Chrome. I'm going to start here because I wrote an article on my website, goobar.io, which is basically called What's New in Android. And it basically calls out this stuff. So in particular, the Android 11 developer preview, as well as some of the things that I found most interesting from that, which we'll look at in a second. Android Studio 3.6 dropped, Android Studio 4.0 update, and even a 4.1 update. The material motion like we talked about, the store 4.0 update from Dropbox, and specifically Mike Nakamovich and Ayit Boyer. That's really interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And GitHub CLI, which I talked about, I think, at the last live stream, but I've been playing with some more as well. So yeah, a lot of stuff here. And really, I just want to take a few minutes and chat through a couple of these things, point out some of the stuff that I have found interesting, and then we'll jump back into the community questions. So if we go back over here, we look at the Android 11 developer preview. This is on developer.android.com/preview. And basically, this is just the early look at whatever that next version of Android is going to be for us. So I am still kind of wrapping my brain around Android 10 and all of the updates that have come with Android 10. In fact, just this week, I was working with scoped storage issues. So to get an Android 11 preview feels really early for me, but it's good, I think, for the platform to get that early feedback. One caveat here is if you're learning, you're maybe a junior developer, even heck, senior developer, mid-level, whatever, like we don't need to jump right into this stuff. Like it's good to be aware of what's coming, but I know most of us are struggling to just stay on top of our day-to-day work. So things that are coming 3 months from now, 6 months from now, even a year from now, it's hard to necessarily be that concerned with. So if you're not overly excited about this right now or just not overly concerned, I totally understand that. That said, I do still want to talk about some of this stuff. So thankfully, it's kind of nicely broken down into behavioral changes here, privacy features, new features in API. So we're just kind of roll through some of these things. So on the behavior changes side of things, we have some updates here telling you things like, job scheduler, API limits changing, updates to now being able to do one-time permissions for workflows. So rather than saying, allow all the time or allow anytime the app is open here, you might have, allow this time only. So that's an interesting change we'll have to think of. Continuing updates to background location access, the storage UI. Like I said, this gets into some of the scope storage stuff, which again we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Like I said, file access works into that. Some fairly kind of low level behavior changes here, but things that it's worth looking at just to see if it might impact your application so that you know if you're gonna have to fix things down the line. If we come over to the privacy feature section, this is where the scoped storage information starts to become kind of really relevant here. So top privacy changes. You can see here, scope storage apps targeting Android 11 are subject to scope storage behaviors at all times. So we don't have that kind of legacy storage modifier anymore that we could just drop in the manifest. We actually have to we have to really support scope storage now as of Android 11. That is, if we are targeting Android 11. So definitely something to think of there. Hamza Sharif, hey, thank you. Thanks for joining in. So back over to privacy changes, we also have one-time permissions like we mentioned. Users can grant temporary access to location, phone, and camera through a one-time permission. So again, that's a change from what we've had before and might impact the way we think about developing those permissions workflows for key functionality in our apps. And then again, we have background location access. So if you want to get more info about the privacy thing and some of these changes to permission and background location and whatnot, developer.android.com/preview/privacy. You can learn more about that. There's quite a bit there to review. But again, it's good to just kind of know what's coming down the pipe so that things hopefully do not break too badly on us when these changes come. And then the last thing here, I will look at some of the new features and APIs. So this is the much longer document here. You can see kind of as I just scroll through, it goes on and on for quite some time. So I don't want to go through all of this, but there were a few things that I wanted to point out. So rich media and quick replies, this was kind of cool. I think one of the new features for Android 11 was being able to add more content like images and whatnot into like your notifications, and here being able to add rich media into quick replies. This is fun. I think this makes kind of that quick reply functionality and our notifications much richer, much nicer to use, which I think is a good thing for the platform. What else we have in here? Neural network API, not something that I'm using in my day-to-day at all, but once upon a time I was doing graduate research and we were building neural nets on Android devices. So having these neural network APIs is kind of fun just to see, even though I'm not using them. I'm sure some people out there are using them for really cool stuff. If you're using any of the neural network APIs, leave a comment down below and let me know what you're using them for. I'd love to hear how those are being used for people. Biometric authentication and other biometric updates, that's another thing that has been popping up in several different of these resource documentations, continuing to prove the security around that, continuing to improve the functionality around biometrics like fingerprint scanning, facial recognition, things like that. Let's see, what else do we have here? Chat bubbles, another kind of update they're making to kind of like this rich messaging and communication changes for the platform. Chat bubbles, things like what I think like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger have been doing for a long time. They're bringing like first-party support for that, which is cool. Should make lives easier for developers in theory. We'll see how that works out. Jump back over to kind of my blog post here, just because I have more of these things kind of called out that I found interesting. 5G support. As 5G mobile networks begin kind of rolling out at scale now, Android is getting ready to support that. So they're adding a couple different APIs to help support this. We have this dynamic meteredness API, which basically lets you check if any network, including a mobile network, is metered or not, which kind of gives you a sense of how much data you can consume. And then also a bandwidth estimator to easily receive bandwidth info about your current network. So both of those should make things easier if you're trying to support things that can really rely on 5G. So that could be like real-time data apps, real-time processing of information, games especially. You can transfer, higher asset resources and things like that with 5G. So those I imagine will come in handy for people wanting to take advantage of that extra network bandwidth. Like I said, we already talked about some of these messaging APIs. We already talked about some of the permissions stuff. Definitely important there. Like I said, I spent a day or two recently working on Android 10 scoped storage issues. And I know a lot of people have had problems with how that has been implemented and the requirements that were passed down and breaking their apps. Android 11 is bringing more of those. So if you have an app that does a lot with files, saving them to the disk, sharing them, things like that, you're going to want to take a look at these scope storage changes. One other thing that I found interesting that they pointed out for the Developer 11 preview is Google is committing to a platform stability milestone, which is essentially they're trying to give us developers a date by which we can count on APIs being stable, which will help us in planning out when we can support Android 11. So that should be a good thing. Hopefully they can stick to that. And yeah, that is it for now, I think, on Android 11. Now, the other thing that, or one of the other things that I mentioned was material motion. Now, what do I mean by material motion? Well, the easiest way to describe that is this tweet from Nick Butcher. A lot of people probably have already seen this, given that this has 1.4K likes on Twitter. But basically, there was this blog post that came out on Medium talking about implementing material design, and specifically the motion aspects of material design. And motion, from its very first introduction with Android Lollipop, has always been a big part of material design. But it's always been really challenging for us developers to actually implement and realize that in meaningful, visually appealing ways in our apps. So this article is really interesting from kind of the design side of things, how they think about motion, how it moves, all that kind of stuff. For the more practical side of things, for us developers, we have this new library, part of the material design components, which you can find here on GitHub. So here, this is the material components kind of org, material components Android repo. And with this 1.20 Alpha 5 release, we have support for these new material motion, basically artifacts. Oop, no, sorry. That's not what I wanted. Here, I think it's the GitHub sample here. Yes, here we go. So here, Material Components Android repo again, in their theming docs here and for motion, it steps through kind of these 4 motion patterns from the material spec and shows you how to implement them with these new libraries. So if you look here, we have some really nice animations. And essentially these are helping us do things like shared element transitions, fragment transitions across different screens. And if you just watch these look really cool. And these are common patterns that we see in apps, but have been traditionally kind of challenging to do. And so again, with the 1.2.0 Alpha 5 release of the material design components for Android, we have some new APIs for working with these. If we scroll down, you can see that it gives us some just practical code examples on how to work through this, which look fairly straightforward. I haven't had a chance to really dive into this and use yet, but as I have scrolled through these, you see a lot of this code looks quite a bit simpler than what we would have had to do in the past. And so hopefully this can provide us some nice guidance on how to work with this. and also hopefully just make this simpler for us to implement. So I'm really crossing my fingers on that one. Let me know if you have tried out the new motion APIs and the material design components. Let me know what you think if you have. And let's check in on the comments here. Cool, we got a couple. Abdul Rahman says, hello, here's a portfolio project I'm working on. Okay, we'll definitely check that out if you want to share it. Ethan, hey, good evening to you as well. Thank you for joining in once again. I think you've been here for pretty much every live stream, which is awesome. I appreciate that. So yes, back over to more of the what's new, because like I said, it has been a busy couple of weeks in the world of Android. So we have more new stuff to talk about. And the next thing is Android Studio here. And we were treated with not one, but two, maybe even three Android Studio releases recently, like big Android Studio releases. So if we go over here to the Android developers blog, we'll see that on February 24th, earlier this week, we had the first full stable release of Android Studio 3.6. Now, what does 3.6 bring? Well, there is this YouTube video right here that talks about it in depth. I'm not going to sit down and watch that or anything. Well, actually, I take that back. I've already sat down and watched it. I'm not going to make you sit down and watch it with me again, but we will run through some of these updates. So we have these kind of changes to the design view. So we have this split between kind of the XML and the design view, which I've heard some people don't like. I don't mind it, as I find myself using the design view more and more for constraint layout. This color picker resource tab, which is kind of cool. I like some of the changes they've been doing with like the resource manager. And I think that that's going to continue to get better and make it easier to work with these resources. And hopefully also as theming starts to get a little bit easier, hopefully being able to kind of more easily tie in the resources and stuff with the theming, I think will be good. Probably the biggest feature update that comes along with Android Studio 3.6 is a ViewBinding. So ViewBinding, like I mentioned earlier, was kind of this new feature. It's similar to DataBinding, but it doesn't actually provide the two-way binding aspect, or really even the one-way binding. It's really more about generating references to the views in your layout. And it does that in a really performant way. So we're going to talk more about view binding a little bit later. But Android Studio 3.6 is where we can really start to make use of view binding for the first time. Excuse me. We have updates to the NDK. If your project is using C++ at all, those are always beneficial. Android Studio is built on top of IntelliJ, so we're getting an IntelliJ update for the underlying frameworks and stuff that Android Studio are built upon. We're also getting new updates to apply changes. This is another one that I haven't been using much because I've been burned on some of this, hot reload, apply changes stuff in the past versions of Android Studio. So if you've been using apply changes in Android Studio 3.6, let me know in the comments how you like it, if you've had issues with it or if it's been working. I need to try it out for myself, but I just really haven't gotten around to it yet. What else do we have here? We have updates to the emulator, I know, to support, let's say, multiple displays, which is coming up as we think about foldable devices. And another one that's probably pretty beneficial, especially in areas with low bandwidth, resumable SDK downloads. Those SDK downloads get really big sometimes. And so being able to pause and resume those, I think will be pretty beneficial for a lot of people. And oh yeah, we have some more updates to the profiler as well, which are nice. Leak detection, I think, is back here. I think that had been removed or kind of handicapped in some way. I can't quite remember, but we've got that. Class deobfuscation, that's useful. So yeah, here's kind of like the long list of updates here at the bottom of this blog post. So if you want to check it out more, like I said again, it's the Android developers blog. But in addition to that, we also have had updates to Android Studio 4.0. And honestly, I didn't even realize until I was prepping for this stream, but we have Android Studio 4.1 out there as well. And so if we come look over here on the left, or excuse me, on the right-hand side of the screen, maybe, there we go. You see Android Studio 4.1 is bringing us Jetpack Compose support. As of Android Developer Summit last, I think, October, Compose support was in Android Studio 4.0. Reading these release notes, it seems like that has been split a little bit. So now it's looking like Compose is in 4.1, which makes me wonder when 4.0 is going to be dropped. I kind of assumed we were going to get 4.0 at I.O. along with Jetpack Compose, alpha or something. Maybe that plan is slipping. Maybe we'll get it earlier, later. I don't know. We'll see. What do you think? What do you think we're going to get a Jetpack Compose alpha or beta? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, again, so Android Studio 4.0, you see here, is bringing lots of stuff with it. Live layout inspector, multiple preview, being able to see different previews of your screens all at once. The motion editor, really a whole lot of different stuff. But the big one that we've been waiting for, I think, is the Jetpack Compose support. So it looks like that now is coming with Android Studio 4.0. So we'll have to probably wait even a little bit longer for that. But like I said, we've got multiple versions of Android Studio dropping on us and being updated at the same time. A pro tip here, if maybe you don't know this already, but you can work with multiple versions of Android Studio on your development machine side by side. So it's really not a bad idea to have a stable version. So in this case, Android Studio 3.6, and a developer preview version such as 4.0, just to be able to test out the new functionality and see what's coming. It's great for like kind of sandbox projects. If you want to play with Compose, for example, you could download 4.1 preview. And if you use the preview version of the IDE with a stable version of the Android Gradle plugin, you can really have a pretty stable development experience and get some of those new features even. So little pro tip there, if you have been kind of afraid or wary of trying the new IDE because you don't want to have an unstable development environment, I totally understand that, but you can have them side by side and kind of get the best of both worlds, which is pretty awesome. All right, so that I think is pretty much it for kind of the what's new section here. I could probably go on and on about some of the stuff, could go into more demos about like GitHub CLI, talk about store some more, but we're gonna kind of leave it here for the moment. And we're going to go on to our next question. And the next question here, like I promised before, was the question of ViewBinding versus DataBinding. And so like I said, Android Studio 3.6 dropped this week for Reels, which means we have ViewBinding support, which means a lot of people are wondering, should I be using ViewBinding? Should I be using DataBinding? What is even the difference between the two? So I want to talk about that a little bit here. And to start, we just want to show off this image here. This image, I believe they showed on stage at Google I.O. last summer, actually. So it's been a while now when they were first kind of hinting at ViewBinding. And this kind of illustrates where we're at in the world of accessing views and putting data into our views. So we have the traditional find view by ID, which as they show here, it doesn't have any build speed impact, but it's not very elegant, it's pretty verbose, and you don't really get compile time safety. So then we see, an option like Butterknife or Kotlin Synthetics, which are a little bit more elegant, a little bit less code maybe, but don't necessarily give us compile time safety again. And with Butterknife, it does have a build speed impact because that's an annotation processor. Kotlin Synthetics don't, but again, we don't have the compile time safety, and they're kind of a black box in terms of how they work. So if we look at the options we're discussing today of DataBinding or ViewBinding, we can see that DataBinding is elegant. Again, it kind of does some code generation for us. It wires some stuff up automatically for us. It gives us compile time safety because it does generate a binding class that contains references to the view elements in our layout, which is essentially what ViewBinding does. But DataBinding does have a build speed impact, again, because it's taking into account annotation processing. So that's where ViewBinding is trying to succeed. ViewBinding is trying to give us kind of the best of all worlds. It's elegant because it's generating this binding class for us. We get compile time safety, which is really nice, but then there's no build speed impact, or really very minimal build speed impact, because there's no annotation processor to this. It's not trying to bind the data for us. It's just generating a binding class for us. So this can be done pretty cheaply at compile time, which really lets us, like I said, kind of get the best of both worlds at the cost of not quite as much functionality. So let's go back over here to kind of our notes here. So kind of the first few things here to consider for ViewBinding versus DataBinding. So ViewBinding does less than DataBinding. That's one of the key things here. DataBinding generates the ViewBinding class and then also can kind of magically bind the data from your model object into the layout itself. And it does that with binding expressions and binding adapters. ViewBinding doesn't do that. All it does is generate references to those views. So it's doing less. Because of that, ViewBinding is more performant. And we talked about that already, because it's not using an annotation processor. It's not kind of generating the logic for actually binding that code. It's just getting references. So it's more performant. It doesn't have as big of an impact when we're trying to build our app. And then one other kind of benefit here, potentially to ViewBinding, is that it doesn't change the way we build our app. When we're working with DataBinding, when we have the XML, we actually have to change the way that XML looks. And we can actually see that if we come over to the browser once again. So here I am actually I'm at codelabs.developers.google.com, and I am in the Android DataBinding code lab. And we'll actually see here an example of how to set this up. If I zoom in on this a little bit, hopefully we can see this code okay. But basically, they're starting here with a regular constraint layout, as many of us are probably familiar with. And they've converted that to a DataBinding layout, which wraps all of that constraint layout code that we regularly have in this top level layout element. This is what essentially indicates to the compiler that we need to consider this as a DataBinding layout. We need to generate all the binding code and all the binding logic. With ViewBinding, we don't have that. Essentially, you enable it the same way, you don't enable it the same way as DataBinding. It's slightly different. Instead of saying DataBinding enabled true, you say ViewBinding enabled true. So it's basically the same, but the name changes. But once we have that in place, we don't have all the magic. We don't have to change our XML or anything. It's just enabled for that module, and we're going to generate binding classes. And let's see if we go back over here to the example. Should have just left it there. So with ViewBinding, we're going to generate binding classes that look pretty much like this. Like this. We zoom in. So if you had a layout called result profile here, it's going to generate a class called result profile binding. You can then inflate that, and then you can get access to the elements in that. So you can get access to the root element in it, or let's say here that you have a text view called name. You can say binding.name.text, and you could set the view model name property to that text view property. And so that's how you can do this binding. So you see, DataBinding would handle that for you. ViewBinding gives you a reference to that view, so you don't have to call find view by ID, but you still have to bind it yourself. So that's kind of the main difference there between the two of them. ViewBinding doesn't bind data in any way. DataBinding does, ViewBinding does not. That's kind of the key difference there. And as we talked about earlier, DataBinding, like I said, it can do a lot of magic behind the scenes with binding expressions in the XML, putting logic down in your XML, with binding adapters and two-way binding adapters and inverse binding adapters, which can let you kind of move data from your model layer to the UI and then back to the model. All of that's great, but it hides the complexity in kind of XML or in these binding adapters, which are not easily available. And so for me these days, I have tended to stay away from DataBinding, even though in the past I've used it well, and I think it works. It just hides complexity in a way which I don't think is the best. And now that we have ViewBinding, which is kind of a more performant option, I think for me, my preference would be to use ViewBinding. And if I have complex logic for how I want to show that data into the UI layer, I'm gonna either put that in my view model or in the UI layer, wherever is most appropriate, and put that just in places that I'm more familiar with looking for complex logic. That's kind of my 2 cents, my opinion. You know, try it out for you and see what you think. But I think that advice will serve you well. Okay, that is it, I think, for just some of the updates that have been going on, some of these questions about view binding and data binding that I was asked. Hopefully that gives you some sense of what's going on there. I'm gonna take a big drink of water here because my throat is getting parched, and then we'll open it up for any kind of questions in the chat. I know we have, I think, at least 1 or 2 questions. Alrighty, so first question here. Throw it up on the screen, maybe. Yeah, there we go. So first question from Benny, which again, Benny, thank you so much for tuning in. You've been here for the last several live streams as well. I really appreciate that. So Benny asks, I have a question about live data. Whoop. Let's throw it back on the screen. Let's say you get some data from a repository that you want to manipulate in the view model. How would you subscribe to it? So that's a good question. So you have your repository, maybe even multiple repositories. How do you subscribe to that in your view model? And then eventually you're probably going to want to expose that in some way. So the low level how of this, I think, depends somewhat on how your repository is exposing that data. So you have a few options here. You could have, let's say, a traditional callback mechanism where you call a method, let's say load data. The repository is going to load that in whatever way it is, and then it's going to invoke your callback. So that would be one way. You could have a callback essentially for each of these calls from your view model layer. You could be calling these methods on the repository and listening for these callbacks, and then within those callbacks, you could be responding by updating the UI in whatever fashion you need. This could work really well if you don't have a lot of active data changes. If you simply have like a one-off loading operation and you're just going to show and update the data once, then that callback approach might work just fine. If you want to be a little bit more reactive, or maybe you need to be more reactive because you have data that's going to be changing multiple times, you might be using something like live data, RxJava, or Kotlin flows. Now, essentially, all of these let you represent streams of data. So at your repository layer, again, that might be loading that data however you want. It could be loading it from the database. It could be loading it from, let's say, a retrofit service. In either of those cases, you might be able to, again, use Flow, Live Data, RxJava. But it doesn't have to be coupled to that view model layer. That's the nice thing about the repository. It can abstract some of that away. So you don't have to know how the data is being loaded. But you can decide how that data is going to be exposed for your consumers, in this case, the view model. So in that case, like what I have been doing lately is responding to one or more repositories by essentially subscribing to them in kind of the reactive fashion. So with like RxJava or really any of these solutions, you would have something like a combine operator or like a subscribe if it's a single option. But the idea is that you could be listening to updates in these. So as your repository is sending you events down, you can collect these in some way. If you have multiple, you might collect them and merge them together. Then you essentially give yourself a single stream of data to process these. So essentially you'll end up with something like an on next call that basically says, every time I get new data from my repository, do something with it. So at that point in your view model, you might take the data from the repository or your multiple repositories and combine that or manipulate it in some way and basically decide what is the current state of my UI I need to be now. So maybe this is processing data and creating a list of view items to put into an adapter. Maybe this is pulling out the title and the description and some other metadata. Whatever you want, you can take it in that on next call that is collecting all of these different data calls essentially, and exposing that in some type of view model, data model that is then bound to the UI using something like DataBinding, ViewBinding, some of the other stuff we talked about. So that's how I have tended to do that. If we throw the question up one more time just for review, let's say you have a repository and you want to manipulate it in the view model, how would you subscribe to it? So yeah, you could use, like I said, a callback approach if you're doing one-off operations, or what is probably the more scalable approach, using something a little bit more reactive, like a live data, like RxJava, like Kotlin flows, something that is going to respond to updates from your database or your network. And then that way you can process it in more of a functional way. You can add error handlers at different steps. You can combine different data sources and ultimately end up with what I think is useful, which is a single source of truth, a single model that goes to the UI to represent the current state. That's how I would think about it. Hopefully that helps a bit, Benny. If there's something I missed, feel free to follow up with me either in the chat or later if you get a chance to listen to this. Thank you for the question. So Ethan asks, are you going to Google I/O? Because I am. That's awesome. Congrats for you for going to I/O. Is that your first I/O? If you're still listening, I'm curious. I am not going to I/O this year. At least I don't think. I didn't think I was going last year either, and I still ended up there, so who knows what's going to happen. But for now, I'm not planning on going to Google I/O, unfortunately, because I am teaching an Android development class at a local community college, which starts early in April. And that class will be taught on Tuesday nights late. So I wouldn't be able to get down to I/O until like the middle of the day on the second day at the very earliest. And if I'm already missing half of I/O, I just didn't feel like it was going to be worth it to spend the money on the ticket and the hotel and everything and come down. So unfortunately, no, I will not be at I/O this year, I don't think. I wish I was, but I will definitely be watching. I'll probably live stream at some point. Maybe I'll even live stream myself watching the keynote live stream or something. Who knows? But I'll definitely be trying to throw out my comments as I watch it because it is fun. And to everybody who's joining in, yeah, Ethan, sounds like first time at I/O. So that's awesome. It's super exciting. Have fun. Maybe I'll do a live stream or a video at some point about tips for surviving I/O, essentially, because it can be very draining. It's a lot. But yeah, that's awesome. Hope you have a lot of fun. And if you have questions about I/O, feel free to hit me up, and I'm happy to answer any of those. So Ethan also asks here, when you are building apps, how do you organize tasks? By architecture, layer, all repos, then all view models, then UI, or by feature? So yeah, awesome question. I tend to organize by feature. I think you can actually you can do both at the same time. I think it's more about which is the higher level. So for me, I tend to think about things at feature at a high layer. So let's say I need to authenticate. I want some type of authentication flow in my app. I'll probably have an authentication module. So that at the highest level there is grouping this by the functionality, the feature of authentication. Now within that, you might even have kind of sub features. Maybe you have a social auth screen, an email auth screen. So those could even be kind of sub features to organize by. Within that, once you get down to a pretty fine grained level, then you might break things out by more of the functionality layer. You might have a package in there that's all of your model objects. Maybe you have another package that is your view models or your fragments. But for me, that's at a pretty low level. I think at the higher levels, feature for me is just what I found to work best. I think it gives you a nice clean split. And conceptually, when you start thinking about multiple modules, especially dynamic feature modules and stuff, if you think I need to grab authentication functionality, you can just go out and grab that module or that package. Whereas if things are kind of split out more by the functionality rather than the feature, it's harder to make that split because you're kind of grabbing a whole vertical set of things rather than a constrained set of functionality. So I package primarily by feature, but within that, you might end up with something that looks like kind of packaged by functionality or packaged by layer nested within that. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. Oh, throat is dying on me today. Alrighty. So yeah, stick around for another minute or two here if we don't have any more questions. If we have any more questions, feel free to throw them over. I know we have a few people that look like they're still watching. Yeah, this is, I think, the fourth live stream here. I'm having fun doing this. If you're enjoying this, if you're watching it after the fact or live, let me know in the comments if you have enjoyed the live streams or if you have suggestions on what you would like more of. I've wondered if maybe just doing the whole thing, question and answer, would be more beneficial, or if we wanted to do more in sort of like the exploring a topic or kind of live demo kind of stuff, if that would be more useful. I'm very open to thoughts and suggestions there for how to make this helpful for all of you. But yeah, I think I'm definitely committed to keeping this going. I think it's fun, and I like the more direct one-on-one communication with everybody who gets to watch or watches this after the fact. And it looks like we don't have any more questions here. Oh, we got one more question. Sweet. Ethan asks, how many subscribers do you have? No pressure to answer. I don't mind answering that. I think today or tomorrow I will cross 4,000 subscribers. So as big YouTubers go, that is nothing. But for me, I didn't think I'd ever even have like 100 subscribers. So I'm still pretty excited about having 4,000. My channel was kind of met the monetization milestone recently, so I can now make like a tiny little bit of money off of this, which is kind of nice. Doesn't pay any bills or anything, but it's just kind of fun to be able to say actually make money off of it. No, I'm having fun doing this, and hopefully I continue to like find more ways to make this useful. It's tough when it's not kind of a full-time gig, having a full-time job and all this other stuff going on makes it challenging, but this has really been a lot of fun for me as a creative outlet, and it's just to get more in touch with the community. So kind of regardless of subscribers, I want to keep spending time and energy here, and definitely plan to, throughout this year and hopefully beyond as well. And also, I guess I'll just say, like Ethan, Benny, I know other people that keep tuning in. Like, I really appreciate like seeing faces come back and everything. So, thank you so much for joining in and, asking questions and all of that stuff. It means a lot. It makes it easier to kind of keep doing this stuff for sure. Benny asks, as far as I know, you do a lot for remote developing. Do you also do something like pair programming? Yes. Pair programming there, if yes, how? So I think the question here is like, when working remotely, can you still do pair programming? Benny, if I didn't quite phrase that correctly, let me know in the chat. Can you still can you still pair program when remote? And the question is absolutely yes. It can be challenging. The challenge there is basically whether or not both parties have a decent internet connection. And one other small caveat, and there's a story attached to it, but if both parties have like a functional computer. So we'll talk about the internet one first. I think pair programming works really well remotely if you have a good internet connection and you can share screens and see each other on video. Working remotely, being able to see each other across a video like this is key. You get so much information from body language, from facial expressions, that it really makes it a lot easier. So if you have a good internet connection and can do that, then pair programming really doesn't become too much of an issue, because one person or both can share their screen and you can walk through things together like you would if you were sitting there. Another challenge with that though is like you want to make sure you communicate with both parties about your computer hardware, and if you're having issues like with things running slowly or whatnot, because you might want to optimize your time by building with the more performant machine. And like I said, there's a funny story about this that I'll tell. Because one time I was pair programming with a coworker who was in India. I didn't realize at the time that he had a computer with something like 4 gigs of RAM and an i5 processor, which, you know, is a fine for computer for a lot of things, but for Android development, it's not great. And so he was experiencing something like 10-minute local build times, which I had no idea until we sat down to pair program. And he was kind of driving the pair programming exercise. And we would make a change and then we would rebuild the project. And I couldn't understand why it was taking so long. Well, eventually, through the pair programming, I realized that he had this really low powered machine. So we switched over to my machine. We finished the pair programming, which went much faster because I had a newer computer at the time. I then immediately emailed his manager and said, hey, we need to get him a new laptop. His laptop is like costing him tons of time, which is costing us money and efficiency. We need to improve this. So then they went and bought him a brand new computer. So then he had the fastest computer on the team. So then when we pair programmed, we would do stuff on his machine because of the local build times. So being in good communication, talking about like whose machine might be faster, who knows the source code better and can maybe drive the project quicker, things like that. But I think like all of that, like I said, it's perfectly manageable. And I pair program with my coworker quite a bit, and we get on video chats quite a bit and discuss technical things and don't run into really any issues with it. I mean, it's taken some practice for sure. I've been working remotely for over 3 years. He's been working remotely for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, I think. But it can definitely work. Mahidi, thank you for the question there. What configuration do you suggest for Android developing? So I'm assuming this is what type of computer hardware configuration we're talking about here. So if we're just assuming that money is not an object here and we can afford the best computer we can find, then something with at least 16 gigs of RAM is really great. If you can get something like 32, even better, just because Android Studio and Gradle, specifically the Gradle plugin, can take up a lot of memory as it's building. So the more RAM you have, the better. And then also you're gonna want a fast multi-threaded processor. So something like a powerful i7, maybe an i9 even, if you really have a lot of money, you know, that can definitely help. And then, you know, for like graphics card, unless you're developing like games or you're doing something, you know, like Unity or Blender or something like that, I don't think the graphics card matters too much. In terms of chipset, but going between like Intel and AMD shouldn't matter too much, although with certain AMD processors, there can be some configuration settings you have to change in your BIOS to make sure that the kind of like Haxum, I can't even remember what it is, but like there's something for the emulator to make the emulator work properly with AMD chipsets. And so sometimes you have an issue with that and you might have to tweak some settings at a low level. But that's very easy to work around most of the time and shouldn't matter too much on that. Ethan comments, 16 gigs is a lot of memory. 100% agree. Yes, there's sort of like a running joke kind of in like the Android community is just like the more memory you throw at Android Studio, the more it'll take. There are definitely optimizations you can make. You can configure in kind of like your Gradle.properties, I believe, for your local machine to tell Android Studio, like, this is the maximum amount of memory you can use at any time. So if you have a machine with, let's say, 8 gigs of RAM, you can make sure that like that works and doesn't crash or anything. It just might slow things down. So like I said, at the beginning, you know, this is all hypothetical. If money is no object, or like if your company is buying your laptop, then kind of the more RAM, the faster processor, the better. If you're buying your own laptop or money just is more of an object, I think 8 gigs of RAM is very doable. 4, I think, will start to become difficult just because you do, like, you'll have Android Studio, maybe you'll have Chrome or some other web browser, maybe Slack, an emulator. Like, it just starts to be a lot of things. So if you can get 8, I think that's probably like the best place to start. And if you can, kind of continue to push that up to more, I think that definitely helps. But like I said, I know that like that's not really financially viable for a lot of people. One other, I guess, thing I haven't mentioned here is operating system. So you can develop for Android on pretty much any operating system, you know, any of the Linux distros to my knowledge, Mac OS, Windows for sure. I've heard from some people, I haven't tested it out for a while, but I've heard that like Linux, I think, is a bit more performant. I'm not sure why that is, probably just because there's like tends to be less stuff on your Linux installation. So if you have a memory constrained system in some way or processor constrained, maybe trying out Linux could help the performance of that. But yeah, that's an option. Otherwise, you know, like I said, Mac OS, Windows totally work as well. Ethan mentions he has 8 gigs of memory. So yeah, I think like 8 gigs is very reasonable. You know, like that will work. I hopefully, cross fingers, but I wouldn't expect that to like crash up or lock up or crash anything from out of memory, especially if it's configured properly. In fact, I might be able to Google this quick and find what those properties are. Let's see. GM memory property. Let's see if I can find this. Yes, so let me share here. Okay, so if you look here, and there's probably other guides as well. Actually, so I'll show you a search. I searched Android Studio JVM memory property, which is probably not the best query there for this, but this first option here, which takes me to this page at developer.android.com, which is titled Configure Android Studio. Under this, there are some settings and guidance for kind of making Android Studio more performant on your machine. So you see here, it talks about some different configuration files that you can manipulate. You can customize some different virtual machine options here. But one of the things to look at here is specifically maximum heap size. So it says like by default, Android Studio has a maximum heap size of 1,280 megabytes. So roughly a gig of memory there. So if you're working on a large project or your system has a lot of RAM, you can improve performance by increasing that maximum heap size for Android Studio processes such as the IDE, Gradle daemon, Kotlin daemon, etc. So this is one of those things that you can update to improve the performance. So that is the maximum heap size within Android Studio. Another kind of thing to point out here, it mentions if you have a 64-bit system that has at least 5 gigs of RAM, you can also adjust the heap sizes for your project manually. So if you go into the preferences for your IDE and you go system settings and then memory settings, you should see something that looks like this, which basically lets you determine, again, that IDE max heap size, and then the daemon heap size settings as well. So these basically say, like, Android Studio, this is how much memory I'm going to let you use for these different types of processes. So if you give it more memory, that should essentially give it more memory to work with, which should hopefully speed up the process. Benny mentions, I recently decided to go with 32 gigs of memory because of Android Studio. Yeah, I did the same thing. When I was buying my new machine, which I knew work was paying for a big portion of, I opted for 32 as well because I just knew that would help out a lot. It definitely cost more money, but I think over the long run, you start thinking over the course of a couple years, how much faster that can make your local build times. I think for kind of the company and even for yourself, you get that money back in added productivity. Let's see, is there anything else in here? Yeah, so there's another option in this document which is good as well. So this configure the IDE for low memory machines. So again, it gives you some guidance on if you don't have a lot of memory or maybe a lot of processing power, there's things you can do to make it more performant in those situations. So again, this is the Configure Android Studio guide at developer.android.com/studio/intro/studio-config. So like I said, down here towards the bottom, we have configure the IDE for low memory machines. So that could be a good place to look if you're not sure that your computer is performing as well as you think it could be with Android Studio. Yeah, and then some other guides here on like optimizing performance on Android, configuring for offline, some stuff like that. So that's a good guide to check out. Yeah, that's a good question. That took us to a good place, I feel like. Optimizing the speed of our machine, I think, is a good thing that probably not most of us take advantage of. Like, I'm not even sure that I have all these things set properly on my machine right now. I should probably go back and take a look at that. Okie dokie there. So Ethan sort of asked, like, he said, is it performant Benny in reference to the 32 gigs of RAM? I don't know about Benny. I definitely find on my machine, 32 gigs of RAM works really well. I'm able to have a lot of different things open at the same time and have everything still be fast. Or yesterday, actually, at one point, I had Unity Hub open, the Unity Editor open, Blender open, Android Studio open, a lot of Chrome tabs, and an emulator, and everything was still going. Everything had enough memory. So yeah, it's just like I said, if you can kind of throw money at the problem, which is a very sort of fortunate position to be in, but if you can, or if your company hopefully does for you, it definitely speeds up your development workflows and just overall efficiency. Ooh, need another drink here. Alrighty, so I think that's taken us over an hour here. That's about the amount of time I wanted to go. I have a small window of time here where the house is relatively quiet that I wanted to do the stream and also record some other videos so I can kind of get ahead a little bit because I'm gonna get really busy pretty soon with teaching and conference speaking and whatnot. So I think I'm gonna wind down this stream here. But one last thing here is our question of the week, which, yes, all right. And actually we have two questions of the week this week. We have a bonus. So this is probably a biased audience here since most of my stuff's about Android, but what is your favorite IDE? So for a lot of people, here's probably Android Studio, but let me know in the comments down below what your favorite IDE is and maybe why it's your favorite IDE. And then as a follow-up question, which versions of your IDE do you typically use? Do you stick to like the most stable version of it, or do you work with a beta version or a canary version or something? Like I mentioned before, you can have, at least with kind of JetBrains IDEs and probably most IDEs, you can have multiple versions. So for me, I really like the JetBrains IDEs, Android Studio. I might actually like IntelliJ slightly more than Android Studio just because it's a bit more general purpose. But you can have, let's say, Android Studio Stable 3.6 and Android Studio, I think Alpha from the Canary channel of 4.1, and you can have those side by side and work with them at the same time. So yeah, what's your favorite IDE? Let me know in the comments down below, and let me know what versions of those you're using, stable, beta, canary, whatever. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close down the stream. Again, thank everybody so much for watching. I appreciate it a lot. Thanks for tuning in. We will get the next live stream scheduled very soon, so you have multiple days to kind of figure out what that is. If you want to kind of be notified when those get up to date, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you're not, hit the little bell icon to be notified, and I will catch you all in the next video. Have a great week. I'll talk to you later.